So let's talk about the outflow tract formation. So as the interventricular septum grew up, like so, and then the endocardial cushion came down and met the interventricular septum, so that the membranous and the muscular septum fused to split the right ventricle and the left ventricle, we still have an atrioventricular valve. The atrioventricular valve must split. Originally, if you're looking down the heart tube, there's just one continuous AV canal. You have to split this AV canal in half. So this is a cross-section of the heart. The atrioventricular canal begins to split in half due to this muscular septum and membranous septum, but there's still a one continuous structure called the atrioventricular canal that needs to be split all the way up from the truncus arteriosus. So this AV canal is surrounded by endocardial cushions. There's an endocardial cushion here, 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 and here. So why is that important? Well, these endocardial cushions will move and grow, and under the guidance of neural crest cells, which will also be very important in this process, we will have a septum that comes down within the truncus arteriosus and helps finish the divide between this AV canal, and it connects with the interventricular divide, or the combination of the membranous and muscular septum. So essentially what I'm telling you is that there is an aorticopulmonary septum, and this makes a lot of sense because you have to have a division of this one continuous truncus arteriosus into its two components, the aortic component and the pulmonary. So there has to be a septum that comes down and divides this truncus arteriosus into a aortic and pulmonic trunk. So where did this aorticopulmonary septum come from, and who invited it? Well, the invitation was sent by the bulbus cordis and the truncus arteriosus. What do I mean when I say that? Well, there are small ridges, like so, within the truncus arteriosus segment and the distal segment of the bulbus cordis. Remember, the bulbus cordis contributes a segment to the truncus arteriosus, and some books will tell you that the distal segment of the bulbus cordis actually gives rise to the truncus arteriosus. It doesn't matter what you want to think. What you need to know is what I'm about to tell you. So these ridges of endocardial cushion, so this is tissue just like the endocardial cushions, it can grow, and there are ridges within the segments, the distal bulbus cordis and the truncus arteriosus. And these ridges will actually fuse at midline, and then they'll spiral down. These endocardial cushion ridges within the truncus arteriosus and the bulbus cordis are called the bulbar and truncal ridges, which makes a lot of sense because they come from the bulbus cordis and the truncus arteriosus. So again, these ridges come together and they fuse at midline, and that's really important for us. So that if we look at the cross-section, you'd be looking down, this is the truncus arteriosus, and there will be growth of these ridges until eventually they fuse at midline, like so. And now you've divided using this continuous structure, and it will rotate all the way down so that one segment is in this direction and one segment is in this direction, and then you eventually have a position so that it connects with the superior aspect of the interventricular septum, which means that you have completely created two outflow tracts all the way from the origin of the great vessels down to the left and right ventricle. This is crazy, right? Why does it spiral down? Couldn't it just go straight down? Well, not really. This is another important tie-in with something you could remember that will potentially help you on your Step 1 exam. This aorticopulmonary septum must spin due to the origin that the great vessels come from as far as the aortic arch derivatives. Alright, what am I talking about? This is another important tie-in that will show you a great way to remember another element of embryology. It's another important tie-in with something you should remember from embryology discussed elsewhere in your first aid book. I know it's brutal, but just stick with me here. So, I'll quickly draw this rough representation of the developing heart. So again, this is our truncus arteriosus, this is our bulbus cordis, this is our ventricle. And these are our aortic arches, derivative. Which embryologic aortic arch does the arch of the aorta come from? So this is the arch of the aorta. Which aortic arch in the embryological heart gives rise to this? It is the fourth. Now which aortic arch does the pulmonary artery come from? 6 on your diagram. The fifth aortic arch involutes, and it's not even important in the embryology that we know. And that's another place where you could get tested. You would think that it would go 3, 4, 5, 6, but 5 actually does not contribute to the development of the heart. So why am I telling you this? Well, if you can imagine, arch of the aorta, it needs to come like this. It must continue developing in a way that it will sit like it does in the chest. The pulmonary artery in this segment, it needs to go under this aortic arch to reach pulmonary vasculature. So it has to go under this structure, and the other segment here is fine. As you can see, the aortic arch kind of rides on the pulmonary trunk. So if you can imagine, the aortic arch is like this, and then the right pulmonary trunk going under the aortic arch, and the left pulmonary trunk going in front of the aortic arch. So the pulmonary artery kind of is a Y formation, while the aortic arch is like a U. The embryologic fourth aortic arch grows anterior to the right pulmonary trunk, and this makes perfect sense. As you can see here, this aortic arch will grow anterior, and this sixth aortic arch will go behind it. So if you make a peace sign with the fingers of your right hand, and you push your left index finger anterior to your right index finger, and posterior to your right middle finger, this gives you a 3D representation of how the fourth aortic arch will grow in between the sixth aortic arch. And the fourth aortic arch will become the arch of the aorta, passing anterior to the right pulmonary trunk, or your right index finger, and posterior to your right middle finger, which is the right pulmonary trunk, represented by the right middle finger that represents the sixth aortic arch. So again, I like to write the aorta like this, because it kind of looks like an A, but it also looks like a 4, and it helps me remind myself that it comes from the fourth aortic arch. And then the pulmonary trunk comes from the sixth aortic arch. If you look at this peace sign that we made with your finger in between them, where is the root of your left index finger in relation to the dorsal surface or the backside of your right hand? It's pretty far away, right? Too far almost. How is that origin of the aortic arch going to connect the left ventricle all the way on the other side? We have to have this spiraling. How are we going to connect the root of the aortic arch that's all the way over here on the right side with the left ventricle that's going to form on this side? Well, we need some movement, and that's why we have the spiraling. And the same thing goes for the pulmonary trunk. It is going to be here, and needs to connect this way. So we need to spiral some to make sure that this connection can connect here, and the sixth aortic arch derivative, which becomes the pulmonary trunk, can connect with the right side of the heart. And the reason I've been drawing on this slide the whole time is that when there is difficulty with this migration and spiraling, you get a connection between the wrong sides. So the rotation of this aorticopulmonary septum is key to line up the newly developed aortic root and the newly developed pulmonary artery trunk with their respective chambers. This seems pretty complex, but it's much easier to understand if we just look at this image. How does this cause pathology if this process is messed up? So we could have problems with the interventricular septum not forming or migrating properly, or we could have problems with this aorticopulmonary septum not growing all the way down or not spiraling. And in the case here, we have a problem with the spiraling. And in something such as tetralogy of Fallot, there's a problem with overcompensating this growth. And it's excessive towards anterior and towards the right aspect of the heart. Obviously, this is an image of someone that has suffered from a lack of spiraling of this aorticopulmonary septum, which is this structure obviously delineated between the arch of the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. This makes sense because if the aorticopulmonary septum does not spiral, then the structures just move directly down. So this fourth aortic arch, which becomes the arch of the aorta, just comes straight down and connects with the right ventricle. And the same thing with this sixth aortic arch derivative. It just comes straight down and connects with the left ventricle. So now you have two absolutely separated loops of circulation where the left ventricle will pump into the pulmonary artery and it goes to the lungs and returns to the left atrium and then back into the left ventricle. And on the right side, we have the right atrium receiving blood, the right ventricle pumping blood into the pulmonary artery. Wait, absolutely wrong. Remember, we had no rotation. So this goes straight into the arch of the aorta, and then it goes into the system, back into the right atrium. There is no connection between these loops unless you have some sort of atrial or ventricular septal defect or a patent ductus arteriosus. And this is called transposition of the great vessels. What is particularly high yield, and that we will talk about in the pathology section, is that neural crest cell interaction with transcription factors that determine the growth of these endocardial cushion ridges within the truncus arteriosus determines the spiraling. So neural crest cells interact with transcription factors that cause the spiraling sensation. So any sort of neural crest cell defect can lead to not only defects in the other structures that are associated with neural crest cell development, but particularly high yield for this one certain pathology, transposition of the great vessels. Alright, so I don't have a slide for valve development, but we can quickly discuss it because it is testable material. This is newly added material to the first aid book. So remember, we had an AV canal, which means that there was just one big ventricle down here and one big atrium up here. It's just all connected by one canal. And if you look at a cross-section of that, it looks like this, with endocardial cushions here, 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 and here. What is actually surrounding these endocardial cushions? Well, what's surrounding these endocardial cushions is a bunch of mesenchyme. And this is an incredibly vague word. What composes mesenchymal tissue? Well, it's essentially a ground substance, such as glycosaminoglycans or proteoglycans containing mesenchymal stem cells. And these can differentiate into many different types of cells, such as fibroblasts and chondrocytes or chondroblasts. And these produce connective tissue. Okay, great. What am I doing? What am I talking about? Well, if you have mesenchymal stem cells surrounding canals that will eventually be split in two, and then again split to divide the heart into 4 chambers, you're probably going to need something to do that. And what you're going to need is you're going to need this connective tissue produced by these mesenchymal stem cells that become fibroblasts and chondroblasts. So these valves are produced by the connective tissue that is deposited by these mesenchymal stem cell derivatives that directly surround the atrioventricular canal. So if you look at this cross-section, here we split the AV canal with the aorticopulmonary septum and then the interventricular, muscular, and membranous septum. So this is the membranous and this is the muscular component. And then we have the aorticopulmonary septum come down and fuse with that. Now we have a continuous AV canal. And to divide that, we need some valves. So we divided it in half. Now we need to divide it in half in this direction. And this is where the valves come in. And they also come in to split the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk and the left ventricle from the... So now we need to split these two in half. Remember, this is the atrioventricular canal. So when we're talking about splitting the AV canal in half across the waist, if you imagine this is the superior part and this is the inferior part, this is where the atrioventricular valves come from, obviously. And so these mesenchymal stem cells become chondroblasts and fibroblasts that will lay down tissue that creates the valves that separate the left atrium from the left ventricle, which is the mitral valve, and then the right atrium from the right ventricle, which is the tricuspid valve. The outflow tracts include the aortic and pulmonary arteries. So you can derive that the endocardial cushions of the outflow tract give rise to the aortic and pulmonary valves. You can also say that the valves that separate the atria and the ventricles will be derived from the fused endocardial cushions of the atrioventricular canal. So again, here are the fused endocardial cushions of the atrioventricular canal splitting this AV canal across, sort of transecting it. And this makes sense because in this cross-section here, if this endocardial cushion grows towards midline, we split this AV canal completely, while the growth of the aorticopulmonary septum down and the growth of the interventricular septum up initially split this one AV canal along its longer axis, axially, head to toe. So what you need to know is that the endocardial cushion of the outflow tract make the valves of the outflow tract, which are obviously the aortic and pulmonary valves. And then the valves that fuse together, because we need to obliterate this into 4 divisions, so the fused endocardial cushions of the AV canal create the mitral and tricuspid. Excellent.